and play this position, but since I didn't want to play it a couple moves earlier, why would I go into this now? That didn't make any sense to me. Again, c4 is going to come up. This bishop is terrible, and this bishop is wide open. So I had to make a very difficult decision to part with my bishop. And I played this move knight d4. So on one hand, white is going to get the bishop pair when he takes on f6. On the other hand, I'm firmly stopping d4, making the rook d1 move a little bit useless. So he takes, pawn takes, c4, exclam, very powerful move, a move that I actually expected, and he played it without hesitation. Moves such as c4 show how strong a player is, because he realizes that if he puts the pawn on d3, that makes c2 pawn a weakness. If I ever get my rook out, I'm simply going to double up and put pressure against that pawn. Here, black has no problems at all. But what he's doing is that he's improving his pawn structure with this clever move c4, knowing that if I ever take en passant, that of course opens up his rook, and exactly what white wanted to get. So I have to be very careful, and I have to move my knight out of the way. But now he takes to get the bishop pair, and now he plays d3. The big difference now is that the c4 pawn is a strength as opposed to on c2 a weakness. And notice that the type of structure that we got is very similar to the Benoni opening, this pawn structure with d3 and c4 and this wide open bishop. So this is a good Benoni for white. What does black have in return? I have a really passive bishop, my pawn is still on e6 blocking it, and my knight is somewhere in no man's land, standing on the way where he can easily target it with a3 and b4, which is a typical Benoni plan. So I think white got a very pleasant position out of the opening, and my opponent was really in the driving seat from this point on. So I dropped back, and here I wanted to point out a key idea. If he ever plays bishop takes knight, at any moment of the game, his king is always going to be weak. And I actually saw many situations where he can even win a pawn with this kind of idea. Well, in this specific position, he doesn't have clear-cut way to win a pawn. He can try to play bishop f4, and here I was going to maybe sack a pawn with c5. So bishop d6, rook d8, bishop takes, bishop b7. This is the dream position for black. At this point, this bishop is so beautiful and this king is so weak that I don't care about pawns. If I can get my queen out on the long diagonal, the game is almost over. So keep this in mind, that all these types of trades with the bishop gets traded for the knight, I always favor black, even if white wins a pawn. So let's go back to the game. He plays an interesting move, b3. It's kind of a slow play move. He realizes that a3 is going to be met by a5. So he decides to slow play this and also open up potentially his bishop. So I stop it with queen e7, but he simply puts the bishop on b2. But I simply play rook d8, overprotecting the d4 pawn. And now we have a strategic battle of ideas. He's going to try to put a lot of pressure on my d pawn, and I'm going to try to defend it. So f4, taking over space, stopping e5, and he's getting ready to put more pressure on the pawn. a5, this is a typical idea in Benoni positions where I'm going to try to play potentially a4 and secure those squares on the queen side. Queen f2, keeping an eye on that pawn, so I simply defend it with queen c5. Once again, my bishop is terrible, and it's very hard to develop the bishop. He simply plays rook e1 with the idea to put even more pressure on that pawn. I play bishop d7, rook e4, bishop e8. So far so good. I managed to defend the pawn, and the bishop is somewhat improved from the c8 square, but not by a lot. Again, white has a simple game, but what I really like about my opponent's plan is that he immediately senses that it's time to go after my king with idea g4, f5. And he plays this move g4 without much hesitation, whereas some players would think twice about moving that pawn in front of the king. Why? Well, because just look at the position. The king is completely safe. White's rook, together with queen, the bishop, are protecting the king really well, and black's pieces are so poorly placed, I cannot create a single threat against the enemy king. So his plan is very straightforward. He's going to play for f5, bring the rook into the game, and maybe f6, and checkmate me at some point. Really not a good position you want to have against a youngster who loves to attack, right? So let's see what happens next. Well, I have to seek my counterplay. a4, I have to open up files. He simply ignores it. Rook f1. He's saying, you know what, go ahead, do whatever you want on the queen side. At this point, I'm focused on throwing f5 and checkmating you. So, well, I have to bite the bullet. I take on b3, pawn takes. And this is, I guess, what I would consider the first major decision of the game that I have to take. How do I stop his attack? f5. I spent a lot of time in this position, and I ended up playing a human move, f5 myself, which is a temporary pawn sacrifice, which actually turned out to be not so good anyways, because that opens up my king. Instead, black had a very interesting idea to allow white to execute f5, f6 plan, and just get greedy with queen d6. And if he plays f5, I meet it with e5. He plays f6, simply ignore it, and take on b3. Something like this is very scary to play if you're human, because just look at this position. White's pawn is on f6, the queen is about to come in, and the rook is here, the bishop's here, the rook is here, whereas black's queen, and especially these guys, are no man's land, just not helping the king at all, even the knight. Only the bishop is doing something. But this position required some precise calculation, and when I check it with the computer says that black should be able to hold with a really cool idea. If queen h4, this is very important. I don't take the bishop because I get mated. This is game over. Instead, black has a fantastic resource that is very hard to find, even if you see all of these moves. So if you really want to try this defensive resource, you should pause the video and think really hard, because it's a very good puzzle. It's a defensive tactic. Queen g5 is coming. If you play h6, well, that doesn't really help. I mean, he can take on g7, g5 is coming. I think it's just simply going to be checkmate. So the defensive move is rook to d6 exclam. Well, you may say, all right, I can see the idea. If pawn takes pawn, the rook protects everything. But what about queen g5? Isn't this mate? Again, g6 fails to queen h6, you may say. But here, black has a very beautiful tactic. Rook takes pawn exclam, temporarily rook sacrifice. Now you get the bishop. So you actually just sacrificed an exchange. In the meantime, don't forget that you've got two pawns. You want the b3 pawn and the f6 pawn. Does white have any attack? None whatsoever. This bishop and these three pawns are doing a really good job against queen and rook, and it's black who is going to start counterplay with rook a1 or rook a2. So I think it's white who has to be worried now. Wow, what a great defensive idea. So this line, I think, favors black. A better move would have been for white to drop rook to e2. In this case, I can get greedy and get the pawn. And now white has some interesting ideas. One idea involves this queen h6 move. And if I go after the bishop, bishop e4. And now, surprisingly, white has to settle for a draw because this doesn't really do much. f7 is defended, and if anything, white is completely lost. So white has to settle for a draw by constantly giving these checks. Doesn't matter where the bishop goes, the game is drawn. Wow, some really cool analysis here, but I was not up to the task of finding this all over the board under pressure. So instead, I make a very radical decision to stop f5 by playing f5 myself. He simply takes bishop f7 and drops back to e2. All right, you may say, I get the pawn back, so maybe it's not so bad for black after all. But to tell you the truth, with the bishop wide open, the f-pawn still potentially ready to ram through, and the queen over here making my position a little bit more vulnerable than I thought. f5, very good decision on his part. I play rook d6 obviously to try to stop this idea. And now queen g3. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to defend my g-pawn. I really didn't want to play h5 during the game. Again, I took a long time, but I didn't see anything better, and I did play h5. And I think even this position, black's position, is very tough because he has this h3 idea, open up files, and I think I'm just really on the verge of losing. But he decides to try something else. He decides to activate his bishops. So he plays bishop e4, gives me a breather to get the rook activated. Again, he could always play h3 here to open up files, but he had a different idea in mind, which is not bad. Bishop c1, he simply wants to get the bishop over to f4, knight e5, bishop f4, and rook b6. For a while, I was thinking, I'm just holding on. I'm never afraid of f6. I can maybe even just take it with the pawn. If he ever takes here, everything is defending. And maybe, just maybe, I'm getting some counterplay here. But my opponent was once again up to the challenge to find the best move, which gives black a lot of problems. Let's see if we can find his next move here. So let's see. This was after I played rook b6. It's white to move, and white can really create some threats here.